Hello everybody, this is Unit 3, Global Citizenship Education and North-South Relations. This is not going to be a PowerPoint presentation like the weeks before, so I will ask you to print the handout that goes with the video before you start watching this presentation. We're going to start with an introduction about how I got involved in this area. Global citizenship education has been the topic of my research for the last 18 years. Before that, I was a teacher in schools in Brazil. Then we're going to talk about the table itself, and we will finish by talking a little bit about the educational initiatives that will be available for you to analyze for this unit. You will see that right now, if you look at the course outline, there is only one possibility there, which is a documentary about young people going to another country to observe sweatshops in action. And you will still have that option, and I do recommend you watch that documentary, but you will also have other policies, recent policies, and one old policy of global citizenship education available for you to choose from for the educational analysis. And this is because we're now at the time of for you to start thinking about what you're going to do for your final assignment. So right now you have more option, and some of these policies are possibilities for you to do either a knowledge mobilization strategy or a scholarly assignment about them. So I will start by talking a little bit about how I got involved with global citizenship, which I think is an interesting story. It's also part of the article that accompanies the lecture. So it was about 1998. After 8 years in the classroom, I was actually ready to look at different possibilities for my career as a teacher. So I applied for a job at the British Council in Brazil, and it was a job about global citizenship. So it was a job with the Central Bureau of the British Council in England. I was going to be based in Brazil, and my job was to connect schools in Brazil with schools in England interested in global citizenship education for long-term projects that should be reciprocal, long-standing, and committed to challenging stereotypes. So the first thing that my new bosses decided I should do was to go to England to promote the project amongst principals. So they sent me to a principal conference in the UK. And I started talking about the project there, and there was a lot of interest. But I noticed that the interest that the principals conveyed to me were a bit problematic. But at the time, I didn't have the language to talk about, or the vocabularies to talk about this, what exactly the problems were. So I didn't have the language to articulate that. So part of it was that they wanted schools in the middle of the Amazon, out in the sticks, without running water, preferably. And when I asked them why they wanted schools that didn't have much access to resources to link with their schools in the UK, I was a little bit surprised by the answer. So they told me that they wanted schools that were poorer than theirs, so that their students would feel proud to be living in England. And then that really bothered me at the time, because I thought, okay, so if you're teaching the kids in England to be proud of being wealthy, for example, what are you teaching the kids in Brazil? And I did ask them, so what about the kids in Brazil? And they said, don't worry about the kids in Brazil. We're going to send them old computers, old textbooks, old shoes, old pencils. And that really, again, made me stop and think about what I was doing and what my role was in this relationship. So I went back to Brazil, and I decided to talk to the teachers in Brazil. I was working already with a number of public sector teachers. I called this gathering and I asked them, so would you like to link with schools in England? And again, the response was, of course, we would like to link with them. And I then asked, why? Why do you think this is good for your students? And I was partly surprised and partly not by the response. Part of me was afraid of that response, but the response was, we would like our students in Brazil to realize what being developed is all about. So we want the students in Brazil to look up to people in England. And I said, but why? And the response was because they are more developed, they're more civilized, they're more educated. And we want our students to be as educated, as developed, as civilized as people in the first world. And again, before I could take a breath, they came up with, and they can send us old computers, old textbooks, and old shoes to Brazil as well. So again, as a project manager for that specific project, there was no problem there, because there were assumptions that were being confirmed on both sides. So one side was looking up, the other side was looking down, and it was a kind of a perfect partnership. As a project manager, my role was to facilitate this encounter. But as an educator, as I said in the paper, I couldn't sleep at night, because I knew that there were long-term implications of the reproduction of this story, the single story of progress, development, and human evolution, and the cultural hierarchies that go with that. And I could see that being reproduced in the project, and I couldn't, at the time, I didn't have the words to articulate what the problem was. So that was a very formative moment in my education about global citizenship, that there is this prevalent story that is extremely hard to deconstruct, because it's all pervasive, it's all around us, it's the air that we breathe, and it's very difficult for us to question that. So the second thing that happened that was very formative was that I started also working in another project of the British Council, which was a project for capacity building for 4,000 teachers in Brazil, teachers of English in Brazil. And I was also an English language teacher. And we were talking here only about public sector schools. And it was a project funded by the World Bank. And at the time, for me, the World Bank was just like HSBC worldwide. I didn't have any idea of, in my education in Brazil, I wasn't prepared to understand what these global financial institutions do to countries. Actually, in Brazil, I wasn't taught much even about the dictatorship that had happened until the 80s. I was born during a dictatorship, but I went to school right in the democratization process, but we don't talk about things that are still very, very much sore in the country. So when I started working for the project, when I looked at the whole setup, the British Council was actually mediating between the government and the World Bank to administer the funds, and they were bringing English methodologies from the UK, from the Open University, and teachers from the UK to come and teach the Brazilian teachers. And the assumption on both sides was that, on the side of the British Council, was that the methodologies that were good for England, that were being developed there, would work very, very well everywhere around the world. And the assumption on the side of the Brazilian teachers was that if people in England could speak English that well, therefore they could teach English very well, they knew better about the methodologies, and they would be able to help us with English language teaching in the country. So the whole thing about the native speaker. So I started looking at that and helping up with the project and coordinating a little part of this project related to curriculum. And again, just like in the School Links project, when I asked the teachers what they wanted, how they saw curriculum development and accreditation, they really wanted British experts to come and have an overhaul of the system, because they really believed that they had superior education and superior means to create organizations and curricula. So as I started to learn more about the project through the project itself, I started to find out that, for example, the loan that the World Bank had given to the state had several things attached, several strings. So they only accepted to give the loan if the money was spent on services and expertise that the funders provided. So we didn't have much option in the state in terms of choosing other providers or choosing to, for example, develop our own materials. 75% of this funding that was given to us had to return to the bank, to the funders. So in this case, it was England. The other thing was that Brazilians were not to administer the funding. The funding needed to be administered by an international agency. And then when I started asking why, the assumption was that we were not to be trusted with that money. And the third thing was that the whole agenda for education needed to be the agenda that the bank had defined, and therefore they needed to appoint the Minister for Education for the state, which was for me where it really hit hard, because up to that point I was thinking, okay, so if it is aid, like it's fine that they want it back, or that even the British Council is going to be administering this, but appointing the Minister for Education, it really then hurts the sovereignty of the state, the sovereignty of Brazil in defining what kind of education we want for our children. So that part, at that point, I really became suspicious, and then I started to learn more. Then, of course, I realized it was not aid, it was a loan. So it was something that my generation and future generations would still owe back to England, and we were using this loan with all the strings to enhance their own wealth. And then from there, I think learning more about the World Bank was just the obvious thing to do. And that's why I say to people that I was politicized as I was working for the World Bank in this project. But what resulted from all of this learning was that looking at the World Bank policies, I found out that they were also committed to stakeholder consultation. And then I decided, okay, I said, it's in your policy, stakeholder consultation, let's get the teachers to say what they want. And although I was also worried that they would say we want exactly the same, I also thought that educationally we could intervene in this. I didn't know if it was going to work or not, but I tried. So I worked with a group of 20 people, 20 teachers who were in this curriculum project with me, and they had just developed a collective letter asking for this British experts to come to Brazil to define the curriculum. And I said to them, like, before I hand in this letter, I would like to ask a few questions and take some time for us to think about this. And the main questions that I asked was, why is it that we think that people in England know better about how to teach English in Brazil? And we had to look a little bit at the methodologies they were employing and to see if what they were teaching was actually relevant to the context of Brazil, and we saw that it wasn't. So we started questioning why we think like this, where it comes from, what are the implications of continuing to think like that for our own well-being and our sovereignty, our autonomy to define what education is about in our state and in our country. We thought about how can it be thought otherwise? How can we involve other teachers to understand that we have been led to think in a specific way that doesn't necessarily work in the best of our interest? So in a way, this group of 20 teachers became a group of 800. And we started this process of developing autonomy in thinking about these things that was really interesting, extremely scary in many ways, but we worked with the unions and the teacher associations to get teachers to think about English language teaching from the ground up, right? Thinking about linguistics and language learning as not neutral, as a political act, as a historically and socially and politically embedded process, and to think about what in the 200 hours that we have of English language tuition in a Brazilian classroom in public schools, what we could offer the students that would be relevant, not in an immediate sense, but in the long term, taking into account that most of the students that we were dealing with were not in big urban centers. They were not in situations, for example, where they would be seeing tourists speaking English in the middle of this town, in the middle of the countryside, and what they were being taught by this imported methodology was how to help tourists in this town to find the church or the post office, right? Which is probably relevant to cities in Europe where people are likely to find this kind of situations. The other thing that we had to deal with was a sense of inadequacy of the teachers, of the English teachers, or the teachers of English, where they felt that their own English skills were not up to the standard that they wanted them to be, and that's why their students were failing, because they had this idea that in 200 hours, if they did their jobs right, the students would leave high school speaking English perfectly. And they were blaming themselves for not being able to do that. They were also blaming other teachers, which was fragmenting the community to a great extent. So we had to work a lot on realistic expectations and on community building and sustainability of this community to be able to take this movement forward. So the project, once the government shifted, the project ended because they found out there was corruption involved in the management of the funds, and I'm not going to talk about that, but the project ended, and we knew that this was a possibility. So the teachers were prepared. So we had 800 teachers who were prepared for these funds to be stopped, and that's why before the project ended, we had things in place to continue the conversation. So we had the universities, the state universities and the federal universities together, creating what they called centers for pedagogical support for teachers. And from there, it was a coincidence, but the federal government also implemented a curriculum that was ground up, that gave teachers enormous autonomy in defining what's relevant for in their curriculum and for the education locally. And it was really interesting because in other states of Brazil where that conversation hadn't happened, the teachers really rebelled against that. They said, we don't want autonomy, just tell us what to do because it's easier. Like, we want you to tell us, we want the government to tell us what to do. Whereas in my state, which was the state of Paraná, the teachers actually took that responsibility and that opportunity to create a differentiated curriculum and to feel valued first within their own communities, to feel that professional autonomy reinforced and to become leaders in their regions. So English language teaching then started to have another kind of status because the teachers could articulate a vision for education that was very different. So having worked in that area a little bit and seeing what had happened in Brazil, I decided to accept an invitation to do a PhD in England, which for actually my community in Brazil was a bit of a betrayal. Like, you have been talking about this imperialism and linguistic and political and economic, and now you're going to England. But I felt that I needed to understand the process from both perspectives, not from the perspective of the teachers in England so much as how it happens systemically, how the process happens on both sides in ways that involves ways of knowing, ways of being, as well as economic, social, political, and cultural processes. So I wanted to do the work on the other side. So I went to England and started working with NGOs that were deeply committed to global citizenship education. Actually, global citizenship education in England is delivered, or was at that point, delivered exclusively actually by NGOs. So the training of teachers and actually going into schools for one day or a week events There was a network of 52 NGOs at the time, and I started working with this network, specifically with a cluster of NGOs in this network that were doing critical work in this area. It was still very problematic, and I felt that as a Brazilian involved in this, I was being positioned in very interesting ways in this conversation. So sometimes they wanted me to provide the perspective of the South, like I'm representing not only myself, not only my region, not only my country, but not only even my continent, but Africa, Asia, Latin America, all together through my voice. And I started then seeing how or the extent of the problem for how we think about these things on both sides, and started to try to unpack and deconstruct that in different ways. So my PhD was about looking at how policies and practices of global citizenship education in England challenge or reproduce assumptions of cultural supremacy or cultural superiority, precisely when they are claiming to do the opposite. So that was the framework of the PhD. I will put my thesis in the on Connect for the rest of the course. It became a book, and I think the book is better than the thesis, and the book is in the library. The book is called Actionable Postcolonial Theory in Education, and I've refined a little bit the case studies, but you will see in the thesis that there are 2 case studies of policy, 4 case studies of practice, and in the book there is more about the experiments that we did in England to try to challenge some of these assumptions. So it was a period where there was a lot of learning with the teachers, and where I came to appreciate the work of the NGOs and the goodwill that is put in this hope for a better future. And in 2006, that's when I wrote my first article about global citizenship, talking about this idea of soft global citizenship versus critical global citizenship. And that's where the handout comes in. So if you can grab your handout, and we will continue the video. So in this table, you will find 4 articulations of global citizenship education: neoliberal, soft, critical, and otherwise. And what I tried to do was to correlate these articulations with the other conversations we've had before. So for example, soft GCE correlates with the global public good articulation of internationalization, with soft reform, and with liberal humanism in the first article of the first unit. Critical GCE correlates with anti-oppressive internationalization, with radical reform, and with critical humanism. And GCE otherwise correlates with translocalism as an articulation for internationalization, with the beyond reform realm, and with the other articulation in the first article. Now, the neoliberal articulation is not in some of the discussions that we've had when we only had 3 possibilities, but it does correlate with the technicist articulation in the first article. And what I put here, of course, the knowledge economy articulation of internationalization, but what I put here that hasn't been in the other discussions is the protection of capital, which is a different kind of articulation we haven't discussed that much. So I'm not going to go through the whole table. I'm just going to go through a few things about the table with you today. So the first thing I would like to talk about is the fact that in 2006, when I wrote the first article, the 2 orientations that we could see that were prevalent and available in the discourses were the soft GCE and the critical GCE. So 2006, we have this configuration here. And it's interesting because in the field of international development education in Europe, especially in England and in Ireland, you have a very strong tradition coming from the 60s and 70s with an alignment with critical pedagogy for some of the organizations, not all. So you see still critical GCE is fairly strong in a lot of contexts. So there's the story of Oxfam where they were doing some studies about poverty, and they figured out, of course, that colonialism and this imposed development were at the heart of the reproduction of inequalities. So they were asking for money in England to be sent to these countries where they just realized that they were actually part of the problem. But then they also realized that they can't tell people in England that they are part of the problem. Otherwise, they're not gonna give the money, right, to this charitable initiative. So they decided to fund another initiative that had the objective to create these critical narratives, but dissociate it from the charitable initiative. So they funded a magazine called The New Internationalist, which was much more oriented towards what we would perceive today to be socialist ideals, and had much more alliances, and they were much more aligned with critical discourses. So in many ways, we can see between the soft and the critical GCE still a reminiscence of the Cold War, right? So one is a more socialist analysis and understanding. The other one is a liberal understanding that favors individualism and competition, but not to the point that we start to see a little bit later on with the neoliberal one. When neoliberalism starts to be endemic in education, what starts to happen is that the critical orientation starts to disappear, and we have the configuration that we have today in global citizenship, which is different from the configuration of internationalization, because this has a different history, right? So you have a soft GCE and neoliberal GCE, and these two are, I would say, two sides of the same coin, because they really do not go into different conceptualizations that challenge capital or that challenge the benevolence of the state, but they still represent a more neoliberalism, a more capital-oriented understanding of GCE and much more self-interested, whereas soft GCE is more altruistic. It's about charity. So the GCE otherwise, which is the translocalism of the internationalization articulations, it starts to become more intelligible in the so-called global north from 2012. You start to hear it more, for example, in Europe. Of course, it has existed for millennia, but the possibilities of intelligibility are throughout history very uneven for it. That's why we still don't hear a lot about it. It's only in certain pockets, in certain circles, but it's important to remember that it exists, and it has existed for a long time. But one thing that is interesting about this, and that's connected to our history too, and the history of the Cold War too, is that once we have the idea that socialism is no longer possible, that's where the possibility of neoliberalism emerges, like Tina, there's no alternative, we have to all embark on this project. And that's where we have middle classes and aspiring middle classes in the South as well, embarking and embracing the same discourse. Before that, there was still an ambivalence towards either one way or the other, and the indigenous groups would align much more, of course, with socialism, but now the split is so big because one of these perspectives here has been is perceived as redundant, has been made to be perceived as redundant, then we have something missing in this equation. And that's why this perspective here, the neoliberal perspective, becomes so strong and so prevalent in society and pervasive as well. So I won't go through the whole table with you. I'll just comment on the first two rows and the first last rows so that we can have an overview of what these projects are about. So for the neoliberal GCE, the key problem is underdevelopment. For the soft GCE, it's poverty. For the critical GCE orientation, it's injustice. And for the GCE otherwise, what I put here in my own precarious translation is delusion. So the delusion that consumerism, property and accumulation and competition are going to take us to a better place. So the nature of the problem for neoliberal GCE would be lack of adaptability, skills, technology, innovation. So the whole agenda for lifelong learning and even social innovation, a lot of it comes from as a solution for this, for the nature of this problem. For soft GCE, the problem of poverty is due to a lack of education, lack of democratic institutions, and lack of progressive thinking, like this idea of holding on to the past. For critical GCE, the problem of injustice is grounded on exploitation and forced disempowerment and unfair systems that benefit the rich, or that make the comforts of the rich be subsidized by the suffering and the dispossession of the poor. And for GCE otherwise, the problem of delusion is based on a denial of relationships and the denial of accountability that leads to irresponsibility. So there is a very strong sense that the delusion is a delusion that we are separate from each other, that we can't see ourselves as part of each other, and that we are numbed to the sensation that we're actually connected. We're numbed to the pain that we would feel if we saw how much harm we're doing to each other. Now, if you look at the two last rows, you'll see that for the neoliberal GCE, the goal of GCE is to inspire globally mobile and entrepreneurial consumers, to expand markets, and foster growth. Now, growth here used to be associated with economic growth for the country, but I think now we are seeing a shift in this understanding, because it's not in the interest of capital that we keep this idea of sovereignty of nations and countries either. So the relationship between capital and the state is shifting, and the function of the state in relation to capital is also shifting. And I'm going to suggest one of the films in the blog for my feedback of the second unit that looks into that. So please watch out for that. In the example here, I have the goal of global citizenship education from a neoliberal articulation is this idea of a brown girl as the emerging market. And this comes from an article that I put here at the bottom called The Girl Mergers of Feminism and Finance in Neoliberal Times. It's an excellent article that opens up all these cans of worms that we need to look at, but I do recommend you read it. So we look at the girl, and you look at the racialized girl as the potential new market, and that's how neoliberalism co-opts that which used to be resisting it. In terms of soft GCE, the goal of global citizenship education would be to support individuals, to help those less fortunate to catch up with the modern world, so providing opportunity. And here the example would be the brown girl as a human rights advocate. So you see that again in Malala, for example, in many different examples of girls fighting to have education so that they can. It's interesting because it doesn't say explicitly that it is to catch up with the modern world. It's something that's always left implied, that the aspiration is for them to be liberal subjects in first world countries. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think that is also in the article that is cited at the bottom, that I think it's worth exploring. So in critical GCE, we have the goal of GCE as to empower individuals to fight for justice in solidarity with the oppressed, which is very much a critical pedagogy, liberation theology kind of orientation. But also, if we think about the combination of these struggles, and especially with the focus on intersectionality, what I put here as an icon is this idea of a bisexual brown girl as revolutionary, as the vanguard in the struggle against oppression. Now, when it comes to GCE otherwise, the goal of GCE is to decenter, to disarm, to discern, to remember our connections and to unnumber our senses in order to disinvest in harmful dispositions that are related to accumulation, competition, individualism, and separability. So the example here would be a multiversed brown grandma as inspiration and aspiration for all girls. And I have a couple of them in mind, and they are women who can actually be extremely entrepreneurial, that can operate in the neoliberal articulation, that can be an advocate for human rights, that can be bisexual revolutionaries, but that see none of these articulations as defining who they actually are, because their first level of allegiance is actually with the earth and in maintaining a balance between all these relationships of interdependence. So they do not define their identity in single stories, in singular ways. They actually deconstruct the single story of progress, development, human evolution. They deconstruct the hierarchies of culture that we see as a result of the story, but they don't reject things that would prevent their participation in the world. They participate in capitalism, they participate in things in ways that subvert it from the inside and that do not define the way that they exist in the world. Their first and foremost allegiance is with something bigger than themselves, which we don't see in the other three orientations. So I'm very grateful to have met women who are multiversed women, who can operate in many different ways. And they are also my inspiration. That's the kind of grandma I would like to become. So in order to amplify a little bit the voice of GCE otherwise, and knowing that we don't have much access to these kinds of perspectives, what I decided to do was to put two examples at the back of your handouts. One from the Shishkantar movement in India, which is it's just an excerpt of a manifesto of a decolonizing education. And I think it's a very interesting manifesto from the perspective of people receiving, at the receiving end of development, of imposed development. I really like when they say that I can no longer accept a narrative of education that teaches me that I have to compete against others in my community and against peoples from other countries to survive, and that learning is a commodity along with the air, the water, the land and food, and that knowledge is the property of individuals through copyrights and patents. Or that physical work in the fields, in my home and in my community is drudgery, and that the definition of happiness lies in drinking Coca-Cola, eating at McDonald's, using fair and lovely face whitening creams, and chatting on Facebook. So this is from India. The other one is from Peru. So it's a manifesto too that was interesting, because I was part of the group that was there when this was created, and it was only created because we insisted like non-indigenous people from the place were there trying to say, well, we need something to take with us. And they were saying, but these are not principles that we put in the manifesto. This is not something you write down. You have to live it. It's something that emanates from your existence. But we insisted a lot. And they came, something happened, an event happened, and I'll tell you another day what happened. And we ended up with 10 different principles. Here we have 6 of them. The entire planet Earth, Pachamama, is my home and country. My country is my mother, and my mother has knows no borders. We are all brothers and sisters, humans, rocks, plants, animals, and all others. The answers are in each of us, but it's difficult to listen when you're not in balance or present to each other. The priority for life and education is balance, and the purpose is to learn, 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 and learn again. There's no complete knowledge. We all teach, learn, and keep changing. It's a path without an end. And the world is changed through love, patience, enthusiasm, respect, courage, humility, and living life in balance, which comes with recognizing our connection and responsibility to each other. So I'll leave you with that today, and I'll just conclude with some information about the educational resources for this week. So I'm going to ask you to use this table to look at a few resources. Not only the sweatshop documentary, but you can choose one of them, of course. It's not, you don't have to look at all of them, but it would be useful if you had to look at the policies that are going to be available to see if any of them would be useful for your final assignment. So the idea is to use the table, to become very familiar with the table, and to use the table for the analysis of one of the resources available, having in mind that it would be interesting to look at the other resources so that you can have more options for your own assignment. So this is the last unit where we're going to be talking only about the issues, trying to unpack the discourses and go deeper in the problematization of things. In 2 weeks' time, we have the last unit. Unit 4, where we're going to be looking at experiments that have happened in trying to address some of the problems we have identified in the last 3 units. So I hope you enjoy this last problematizing unit, and I hope to see you in our tutorial. Thank you. Bye-bye.